So here's a page of ink and wash drawings. Some of them are short, some of them I spent more time on. They're done with a brown ink, which I'll show you in a minute. Black ink works really well as well. And drawing with a brush is great because you can make planes very quickly once you get used to it. So here's another page. You notice I tend to have the light direction facing the same way on a page to tie the drawings together. So here's the materials I'm using. This is the ink I'm using. It's a transparent burnt umber from Liquitex. It's an acrylic ink. Again, black ink works great. You just want to test your inks out. So this is a little more transparent. Some inks are really strong. Over to the right, I have a little porcelain palette. It's got a little crack in it. It's an ink palette. So you see I have water in there, dilutions of ink, which I'll show you in just a second. There's another cheaper plastic one. So brushes come in a lot of shapes. Round is a good shape to draw things out with. You can push on it and make larger planes with the brush. Filbert's also a really good shape because it has a rounded tip, right? If you're drawing something organic like a model, that rounded end of the brush stroke is really much more useful than a flat, which has a squared off brush stroke, which I don't like as much for this. So let's mix some ink. All right. So before we start drawing, we want to make some dilutions with ink. So don't be intimidated by the ink. The first thing we're going to do is take our ink and thin it out so it's not as intimidating to draw with it. So what I have here is one of these little watercolor palettes. I filled each of these with water except for one. So I'm going to fill one with pure ink, and then I'm just going to dilute it out. This ink is fairly transparent, so you want to experiment with ink you have. Some inks are very strong. This ink is a little weaker. So you can see as I basically just cleanse out the dropper in it, or if you want to just rinse out a brush in it, if your ink doesn't come with a dropper, that works as well. And there you see I have dilutions of ink. It's also good to have a little jar you can clean your brush out in. And these inks are acrylic based. This one's acrylic based. A lot of inks are shellac based. So whatever ink you're using, it's good to rinse your brushes out pretty regularly so they don't get gunked up with acrylic or shellac. All right, so now we're going to talk about ink and wash. We want to start with diluted ink. So you want to start with one of those that has a lot of water and a little ink in it. And let's just try making a little sphere. We have the model, the light's coming from top left, so I'm gonna go a little darker than that. So let's just do a little, something simple we can draw out of our heads, like a sphere, right? Let's say the light's coming from that way, so we'll figure out where the plane break is on the sphere. Now, ink's really useful stuff. I think it's pretty great. I want to set up a figure-ground relationship pretty quickly. So if I just start really light, and you could just, this is acrylic ink. It layers really well. I could just go over and over with the same value, and each time I go over it, it would darken it up a little bit more. So I just want to put the figure somewhere, and if I pull back over into the darks a little bit, see it layers up a little bit, makes it a little darker than what's behind it. And I could slowly pull into the lights. The other thing is, if your paper is wet, right, it bleeds out into it. So you can get a little bit of soft edges that way. Right, so if we're doing some kind of little sphere on a surface, I can see the surface is a little bit wet, so the ink's bleeding a little bit. Now let's go a little bit darker and try and pull up into the inside of it. Right? I just want to get a little bit of a simple object before I start worrying about the model and proportion. That's a lot to worry about. So I want to keep it simple and just try a little practice shape just to get you used to the materials a little bit. See, I can almost take a little bit off if it's wet. Right? And then I can keep cleaning it out, get more diluted, try to come up to the highlight, but I really want that plane break to be very clear on the model. So my little practice sphere, I want to be clear here as well. So Now we want to build it up a little bit. If our sphere has more contrast than what's behind it, it'll show clearer. And you do have, if you make a mistake with this, let's say you put on something too dark, if you use paper towel and blot it off, it's not perfect, but it does mute it. So I think it's good to have a little bit of paper towel in your hand for when you make a mistake so you can try to correct with it a little bit. So now this ink's pretty transparent, so it builds up, it layers pretty well, it builds pretty slowly. So this is another reason to do a sphere. If you're using something like Higgins Black Magic ink, which is very opaque and strong, then you want to test it out before you start trying to draw a person with it, because that's tough. So if I wanted to carry the parts of the shadow all the way up into the highlight, I could go really light up here. See, and I can soften. So there's a couple ways you get soft edges. One is having it wet into wet, where you can blend a little bit with it until it dries down. And the other is building up these gradations. So if I go a little bit lighter out of this one, see, you tend to have more hard edges this way, but as you go over it and over it, my sphere looks a little fuzzy there because everything's so wet. So generally a little drier too. I got this a little bit wet and it's staying out of control a little bit. But now I have a little sphere there and we're ready to start looking at something a little more complicated. Light direction. All right, so let's start with a shorter ink and wash drawing before we go to a longer one. So I want to see how strong the ink is. And then we're going to start the same way as normal, right? Try and get our action first. So we will start with the head, neck, right? Model's pretty straight, so we'll just think of a line to connect the head, rib cage, and pelvis. Pretty straight, a little higher on the left. Then we go for the weight-bearing leg. So I'm starting pretty light because I want to be able to change it. Although on a quick one, I might start a little bit darker than this and build up it up more slowly on a longer drawing. Then the other leg. Let's switch and use a bigger brush. Test out the color. All right, now this ink, since it's pretty transparent, it also it lightens up pretty quickly after I put it down. So head, neck, spine connecting the head, rib cage, and pelvis, weight-bearing leg. All right, where the weight is. Then her other leg. And on the longer drawings too, I can try and leave the page alone so that where the page is light, I basically want to save the white of the page for where the light is on the model. That's actually a pretty important principle for this. So I'm really trying to map things out and set in the shadows and leave the white of the page for where the light is hitting the model. All right, so that's like that. So really, now I have the action there, right? So proportion, I don't really have time to check proportion on this quick of a drawing. So I want to go for volume. Basically, we'll just set in the plane break where the model goes from day to night, right? Very important. I was looking for axis of the shoulders, pelvis, knees, and feet to help me get the gesture down. Now I want to look at everywhere she's in shadow and try and use as big a brush as I can control to get that plane break down quickly. Right, her legs back a little bit, going out of the light. Now, one of the things that will make the model look more like they're in space is if they're lighter and darker than what's behind it. behind them rather. So a good way to do that pretty quickly. Take a big brush, and as soon as I get their hand down there, and put in some value behind the model, right? It'll pull up the lights again a little bit, kind of work the contours, and since it's a big brush, I can pull all the way over. And even the shadows, I don't want it just on the lit side, although you do see that a lot. It'll look more like it's behind the model if we go all the way around them a little bit. So that's a pretty quick drawing. I maybe have time for a couple notes of pure ink. You notice I didn't use the ink pure anywhere up until the very end where I have a little bit of structure everywhere. Now I can maybe pull out a few notes here and there. And you notice I'm only reiterating the darks in the dark. I'm not going to go back over where she's lit with a dark line. I want to stay. I want where the white of the page meets the surround, meets the wash I put behind it, will make a line, just like where I put a dark line down makes a line. So I'm just going to lay this in, and then we'll start a longer one. Right, so that's just really quickly, all we're really going to have time for on drawing this short is some action and maybe some volume, like get the plane break in everywhere on the model that we see it. Right, so let's do a little bit longer drawing. For a longer one, we'll stick with a standing pose and start the same way, go a little bit bigger. And in general, I want to use as big of a brush as I can control, especially because, you know, when you have the wash wet all at once, it stays smoother like this. So we're going to start, we'll go a little bit bigger and start the same way essentially. Right? So, it's a little dark. So staying light. And looking at the head, the neck, pretty much the same thing. So she's going like this. Her weight is really on the leg on the right. So on a longer drawing, on a really long drawing, if you want to, you could even start with pencil if you're going to do a really long drawing. I'm trying to keep this demo sort of pure and just start with ink. But if you had a long drawing and you wanted to, a lot of artists do that. We'll start with pencil to map it out and then start using the ink, which is fine. It's a good idea. I'm just sticking with the brush. It goes pretty quick. And I can stay, if I stay light enough, I think I'll be okay with some of these other marks. But that's why you want to start with very diluted ink. Right, so head, again, if your head's an egg, if your head is an egg that's 1 unit high, your rib cage will be 1.5. And then the pelvis, again, 1, right? So staying light and working my way down. Her weight-bearing leg's about here. And top of the pelvis here, bottom about there. Looking for the axis of the shoulders, axis of the pelvis. And then as I get down, I want to look, her knee is a little bit higher on the knee that's behind, but that's the weight-bearing leg. So I'm going to put weight on that. All right, so a little bit of a jump there. I want to make sure you can see the feet, because that's another good place to look for axis. So axis of the shoulders, axis of the pelvis, axis of the knees, and axis of the feet. Her one foot's on top of the other one. Those are all things that help me get the action down. So now that I have the action down, I want to check proportion. So she is about 4 heads to the bottom of the pelvis. So if I check that, 2, 3, 4. I'm pretty close. So you want to make these adjustments early before you start committing too much to your drawing, right? So if I'm figuring that's the bottom of the pelvis, then I'm going to check from the feet to the bottom of the pelvis and see how far up that comes on the model. Let's see. So that's about the middle. So it looks like I had the legs a little long. Again, this is the time to notice that kind of thing, right? So I have pelvis. And that leg was a little long. So I'm just gonna pull those knees up a little bit. And start to build up. So when you're checking proportion, another good thing to check is balance. So from the front, again, the pit of the neck right here is a good center of balance. So I can look on the model and see pit of the neck to the feet, where does that fall on the feet? If the model was facing away from me, the landmark I would use would be the 7th cervical vertebra, that little bump at the back of your neck. And my balance looks okay. So I've checked some things with, I can check off the action is there. I can check off the proportion. I've checked a few things. So now we get to volume. So I want to use as large a brush as I can control, because that way I can try and keep the ink wet at the same time. So I'm going to start light and just start to map out those big shadows. So once I have a little bit of the volume in everywhere, I'm going to build things up a little bit more overall. So I'm definitely not touching the pure ink until I have really checked my proportion and gotten a little bit of the plane break everywhere, meaning where she goes from day to night. So it's really clear on this where the figure goes from day to night, right? Basically, if the light's coming from this way. So I'm just slowly going through. Fixing the things I was a little off about, which is a little bit of everything. And trying to set up the plane break everywhere where she goes from day to night. So now I doesn't really have a face yet. What's the shadow? All right, so I've got a little bit of plane break everywhere. Her proportion looks okay. Sometimes you can erase a tiny bit if you take your paper towel and get it wet and roll it up like this. If your paper is well sized, you can erase a little bit. It's not something to bet on to be able to really change your drawing, but it can give you a little leeway. Again, also if you have paper towel in your hand, it's a good idea because you have just a second. You can blot things off a little bit. It'll lighten them back up. So it gives you a little bit more forgiveness. It's not really like erasing. You can't really erase with the ink, which is why we want to build it up slowly and not use our pure ink till we have a little bit of value everywhere. Now that I have a plane break on her, I want to get the surround, like what's around her. So testing out your ink value is a good idea. I'll go even lighter. So what I want is, if I go down the lit side of her, right, it shows a little bit better. Because now she can be lighter than what's behind her and darker than what's behind her. So it sets her in space pretty quickly. And as I go back over the shadow side of her, if I pull back into those shadows a little bit again, see, I start to, it makes my shadows a little bit darker on her, and I can start to lose some of those trial lines where I was mapping things out. See, if I scrub it a little bit, it stays pretty pale. And I really want to try and get at the light everywhere. That's a little too dark. So you can really have a little bit of forgiveness with the paper towel unless you catch a little bit of crud in it like I did there. So now I have a fairly faint drawing that has everything in it. So from this point, I can take a little bit more ink on here and start to do some things like maybe pull out, work on the face a little bit more. Start to make some decisions about, I can kind of get to detail because now I have volume everywhere, and from this point it'll be picking through, going and being more specific about where things are, defining my values, building up the darks, building them all the way up into the lights. And see, this is a little bit wet, so that edge is staying a little fuzzy, so maybe I want to be a little careful with that right there and work inside the form a little more. Anyway, so this is really the framework for your drawing. That's the most important thing. From here, I can develop it further. So I think what I'll do is I'll switch to a time lapse, and then I'll build it up from there so you can see the drawing coming along quicker. So now that I'm switching to time lapse, you notice I'm really reiterating the darks and building up from the darks into the lights. And where she's lit against what's behind her, where she has a wash behind her, I'm not going to use that darkest dark to make a hard dark line around her everywhere, right? Where the lit edge meets the wash behind it makes a line, just like where the dark edge meets what's behind it makes a line. So here's another page of drawings in ink and wash, and I think you can use the wash to kind of tie all the drawings together. And again, for a page of these, I like to have the light facing the same direction with any media, actually. But it's really great to draw with a brush. I think you'll find it fun and useful once you get used to it.